Our presenter tonight, Dennis Chinoy, is going to be talking with us about the deep roots and bitter fruits of white supremacy. Dennis and I have been friends for, I think, close to 40 years, and because of that, he felt free to tell me to keep this really short, so I will. Um, our kids grew up together. He and I, our families as well, have had many adventures together in the organization Power and Community Action, or PICA, a number of whose longtime members seem to be on the screen I'm looking at. Um, For those of you who don't know about PICA, it's a Bangor-based organization that he co-founded, Dennis co-founded, as well as several other people I'm looking at, uh, and I've been also a part of for a long time. PICA has a close relationship with the people of El Salvador, and it focuses on issues of social and economic justice, both within and across borders. Dennis brings the perspective brought by his many years at PICA to his analysis of the history and current dynamics within our own country. So I'm eager to learn what he has to share with us tonight. And so without further ado, I'll turn this over to Dennis.
Dennis, you're muted.
Okay, that's better. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So I'm neither a historian nor an expert in race or a diversity trainer or any of that. It's really kind of our collective work in PICA over the years that we've all been steeped in these issues of race and class and privilege. And so I don't think I'm going to be offering any groundbreaking ideas here, or original thinking. What we try to do, and often in PICA, is we try to curate some ideas so we can present them in intelligible form in ways that, in the service of our community's needs for ways to think about and talk about ideas that need more talking about. And so a multicultural community forum like this seems like a fitting place. What I'm going to offer to you is scripted to some degree, just to ensure that I don't blather on too long and miss time for discussion. There will be 4 roughly 10-minute segments punctuated by roughly 5-minute little breaks, mostly for you to take a breath so you don't have to look at the screen unremitting for 40 minutes, and to think about any questions you might have or comments to offer in the chat. It might be a time for 1 or 2 people to offer any thoughts they might have between segments. I hope to leave about a half hour at the end for all of our thoughts, so we can all share with each other, per forum kind of format. It's not, no one likes trying to read and listen to a PowerPoint at the same time, so I try not to do that. Give you time. If there's something to read, I'll try to let you read it. So some of these thoughts are inescapably political, of course, and hasten to say it doesn't reflect Maine Multicultural Center's opinions, except the opinion that it's all worth talking about. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen. So hang on. There's a little of that, and a little of that. And let's see if I can do it. Did it. Can you all see that? Well, you can't, you're all muted. I hope you can see it. I've never given a talk that rhymed before, so there's that. But we'll get going. So first, spoiler alert, we're going to start off with an elephant, and we're going to end up with a cow, but you don't have to remember that. Despite an expanding national conversation about racism in our society, until very recently, there was still a reluctance to name out loud a crux of our social dilemma. It's been relegated to the margins, mainstream dialogue, as though it were a fringe phenomenon rather than the elephant in our living room. But then Charlottesville crashed into our homes, And then a shout out during the presidential debates, as 75 million viewers watched and listened. And then in more flamboyant attire, as the nation looked on, white supremacy invited itself into our national living room and wrecked the furniture there too. So now we look it in the face, say its name, see what it's doing to our country, no longer able to squeeze it back into the toothpaste tube as just background noise. Perhaps we're all ready to see it as peoples of color have seen it all along. The white underbelly of the endemic racism, latent or flagrant, that either props us up or keeps us down. Our nation's founding was rooted in an assumption of white Christian supremacy. So it should not come as a surprise that it resurfaces when conditions are right. And a bit later, we'll look at what those conditions are. For now, we'll take a look at those two different but related tap roots. Related because early on, Christian and white traveled together. Different because these religious and racial origins have different stories, and teasing them apart can help us see what we're dealing with and how we got here. So in this first of 4 sections, we'll look at the religious roots of white supremacy, which go at least 600 years deep. So let's just take a quick 6th century whirlwind tour, then end up back here and now. Like all European colonizations of the New World, our own Atlantic settlements were launched by Christian monarchs who understood their claim to new lands and their peoples to be rightful, even righteous, sanctified by the Pope himself as a project to establish and advance the faith. Here's Pope Nicholas V in 1443, 50 years before Columbus sailed, being pretty specific as to what he was licensing in God's name. The divinely authorized directive is to claim, convert, and subjugate as necessary, a papal fiat enunciated as a doctrine of discovery, subsequently understood by all Christian nations as a mandate that applied to their colonizing projects. Whether by Spanish Catholic conquistadors, bankrolled directly by His and Her Majesty in the Caribbean and points south, or later, in our case, by Protestant settlers sent forth by private investors in a royally chartered company, seeking to establish lucrative trading partners with the mother country. Whether by New England Calvinists in search of a land to establish a holy community without being harassed by a more mainstream Church of England back home, or by more traditional Anglicans in Virginia. The shared vision was that theirs was to be a Christian country. To be more specific, a Protestant country, governed by Christians and in accordance with their particular understanding of God's word. Writ large, across the continent, this was our imagined manifest destiny, taken for granted by the founders and by those to whom they passed the torch. God's plan, a Christian country spanning sea to shining sea, accreting all lands west through purchase or treaty from other European powers who likewise presumed they had every right to transfer their own rights of dominion over the lands and indigenous peoples they had originally acquired through that same doctrine of discovery. The doctrine unilaterally proclaimed by a medieval pope and embedded into US law nearly 400 years later by the Supreme Court in a landmark case called Johnson and McIntosh. Then, settling those lands claimed by hand-me-down, transferred discovery rights, by sending forth waves of well over 1 million homesteaders to 1.5 million acres. Hard scrabble pioneers setting out to make new lives for themselves, having no reason to doubt that the lands they were granted were our government's to bestow. For them, a ticket to a new life, hard won by honest, rough work, and having no reason to imagine themselves to be a colonial expeditionary force. But for the indigenous nations, not a party to the deal, a slow motion eviction notice to be played out over decades, enforced as required by violent vigilantism and US Army troops. A history of genocide, were it to be told, by those who didn't share the Christian nationalist vision of manifest destiny, and of dispossession as implemented by settler colonialism, a term none of us likely learned in the elementary schools we attended. This credo, the conviction that the United States is and must always remain a Christian and Christian governed nation, no matter who else inhabits the land and what they might think about that, has persisted since the founding. But while the message of national obedience to the Lordship of Christ is no longer one embraced by a majority in today's more robust, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society, it continues to be preached not only by a faction of evangelical leaders and media figures, but by some of the highest government officials in the land. Majoritarian disregard of that message these days evokes a sense of victimization in those who hold that we are and ought to be a nation exclusively devoted to worshiping Jesus Christ. Even offering season's greetings rather than Merry Christmas can meet with indignation in some quarters as an act of aggressive political correctness, until what seems to be to some like just a simmering kerfluffle flares into a serious statement of purpose, juiced by white Christian nationalist groups who have always been in the wings. And we see concerted backlash by those who feel deputized by a commander-in-chief and others to take their country back. Here's what happens when acolytes take that advice. You may have missed this particular video clip in January, but I found it pretty stunning. In the midst of ransacking the House of Representatives, these particular patriots, intent on stopping the steal, ostensibly of an election, but more broadly, the theft of their white Christian country, abruptly stop everything to have an impromptu prayer session, asking divine help for their mission to defend America against its enemies. It's 1.5 minutes worth watching. The audio is transcribed more or less at the right. And I'm sorry for the smallish print, but just to fit it all in here. Justice is done. Everywhere, always have the monument on DC. Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. Amen. Amen. Let's all say prayer. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for gracing us with this opportunity. Thank you. Thank you, Heavenly Father. For this opportunity to stand up for our God-given unalienable rights. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these moving songs to allow us in this building, to allow us to exercise our rights, to allow us to send a message to all the tyrants, the communists, and the globalists that this is our nation, not theirs. That we will not allow America, the American way, the United States of America to go down. Thank you, divine omniscient,
love you, and that love Christ. Thank you, divine omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent creator God, for blessing each and every one of us here and now. Thank you, divine spirit of God, for surrounding us with your divine omnipresent white light of love, protection, peace, and harmony. Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name we pray.
I'm Justice. Right. White Christian nationalism is, of course, a minority sliver of a many splendored and diverse religion. We're focused on it here, not because it's representative, but because its strident prominence right here and now demands our concern. So I'm gonna stop here for a second, our first 5-minute break. And there. And I think the way I kind of like to use these breaks, just to give us a rest, first of all, is to take breath. If there's anyone who has anything they'd actually like to share in voice, feel free to do that. Feel free to type anything into the questions or thoughts into the chat. And I'm just going to keep track of the time here for myself. Oh, that's not bad. There. Okay. Let me look and see. Okay. All right. Thus far, I just see a lot of technical things about techniques getting in and out and stuff. If anyone, let me look. I've got 2 screens to look at. If anyone wants to just offer anything, feel free not to. Raise your hand or unmute yourself and speak up. We just have a couple of minutes and we'll plunge back in.
I have a question.
Where are you? Yeah.
I think it's very significant that Biden named white terrorism in the inauguration speech. I mean, your title, say the name. He said the name. And I got chills up my spine at that point because we've never heard that before.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Hope. Yeah. I know it's kind of a fast moving event. Joni.
Question, comment?
Hi, Joan.
Hi. There was a line in their speech or whatever it was, where they say, thank you for inspiring the police officers to let us in. And I thought that was there's been a lot of controversy about whether the police actually stepped down in some way or whether they were just overpowered or not allowed to move in. But I just thought it was interesting that that's how they perceived it. And maybe that's how it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, certainly that's how it was in that room. I didn't show you the rest of it, but there are a couple of police officers there who seemed kind of resigned to that's what's happening. They weren't palling around, but they were certainly kind of being ushers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, it was just so absurd to see the man with the horns and the costume pray, with this prayer. It was just like absurd.
Right.
Although it did kind of match the colonial period and seemed to be fairly similar to the dress that those folks were wearing.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I really appreciate the bringing together so many different pieces in a framework that we can follow. I'm wondering if you found evidence that made you think that the pioneers who were going to plant things in the land didn't know that they were part of a colonial effort. They didn't know that they were taking the land from the indigenous people.
I don't know about that. It was kind of my assumption that most of them might not have given it too much of a second thought. But I don't know. You might get, there's more wisdom in this room here. So did you have some thoughts, Barb?
I suspect they were well aware of it because they were aware of the dangers that they were going into, and they may not have given it much of a second thought because it was so acceptable to do. That may have been the reason for not a second thought. I think it's important for us to think about those things and our assumptions about it in terms of what we might be doing now,
Right.
and our assumptions about what we do and what our intent is. They kind of go together. So I was just curious whether you had found information about that. I hadn't seen anything that suggested that is true. So I was wondering if you found something. Thanks.
Anyone else have any thoughts about that? Or
No, not that.
no?
Oh,
Henry?
Yeah, I have a question. Do you think Christianity is inherently racist, or just that it evolved among a white part of the world and didn't know the other guys, and therefore they, I guess, kind of became the other or something? That was a question.
Yeah, I would say hold that thought.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I'm going to be the way I'm going to do this is stay on schedule. So we'll leave time at the end. Hopefully, you've had your breath of fresh air. My only comment is, in the congressional video, I personally liked that they said it was the white light. You made a mistake.
Dennis, is there any way you can put the link in the chat before
Yes.
we end?
Oh yeah, I think I can. I'll try to do that.
Okay.
All
And I
right.
think there was one more question.
Yeah.
Somebody wants to know, Jay's iPhone, how can we fight white supremacy here in Maine? Which is
Great.
what we're trying to do.
All right. Hold that thought too. It's not. It's not disregarded. It's just we're collecting the broader thoughts for later. It's good. Okay. Are we ready? Here we go. Oh, come on. Okay. Here we go. Part 2. So we're going to leave that religious roots for now, and we'll talk about racial roots. Part 2 there. What's fascinating, I think, anyway, and at first counterintuitive about the racial roots of white supremacy is that unlike religious entitlement, which preceded our nation's founding by centuries, claims to supremacy based on race hadn't much been existed at all, but actually had to be invented, which may sound a little bizarre, but stick with me here. Let me just take you back to the Jamestown colony in the late 1600s Virginia. So the indigenous population, some of whom were enslaved, had drastically diminished as they succumbed to European diseases to which they have no immunity. And the numbers of indentured servants are also drying up, just as the need is escalating for an expanded workforce to grow labor-intensive tobacco on the plantations. Virginia planters import large numbers of African slaves to do their work, which is an employment practice that doesn't conflict with their Christian values, since these slaves are heathens whose enslavement was authorized, if you remember, by the Pope himself. However, Africans' numbers now constitute a significant minority of the total population, rising close to tenfold in 30 years. And the threat and fear of bloody slave revolts is starting to spook the gentry. And then in 1676, Black and white indentured servants in Virginia jointly staged an insurrection against the colonial governor and burned much of the Jamestown colony to the ground. Alarmed at this interracial alliance called Bacon's Rebellion, wealthy white Virginia planters in response deployed the most time-tested of strategies to maintain their power: divide and conquer. But to establish such a hierarchy, they had to highlight a distinguishing trait, potentially divisive characteristic of no previous consequence, and that trait was race. Calculated to drive a wedge between a coalition of allies to compensate one segment of aggrieved colonists with a sense of superiority in order to pacify the resentment of an upper class, to induce a poor underclass of colonists to identify primarily not as poor, but as white. The benefits accruing to whiteness could not be primarily economic because sharing the wealth was not on the agenda. The caste system they envisioned was designed to create a steep divide in social status between those whites leading lives of hardship and blacks who would be rigidly and brutally consigned to the very bottom. W.E.B. Du Bois, centuries later, described that white economically subordinate classes, what white economically subordinate classes would receive as psychological wages. If this idea that race was invented is one that you balk at, you are not alone. Leaving colonial Virginia for just a second, say hello to Isabel Wilkerson, an acclaimed writer about race, whose latest book is entitled Caste, in which she relates the story of her own initial befuddlement. She writes, "A few years ago, a Nigerian-born playwright came to a talk I gave at the British Library in London. She talked with me afterward and said something I have never forgotten. It startled me in its simplicity. You know, there are no black people in Africa," she said. Most Americans have to sit with that statement. It sounds nonsensical to our ears. Of course there are black people in Africa. There's a whole continent of black people in Africa. How can anyone not see that? Africans are not black, she said. They are Ogbo and Yoruba, Ewe, Aka, and Deble. They are not black. They are humans on the land. That is how they see themselves, and that is who they are. They don't become black till they go to America or come to the UK, she said. It is then they become black. Likewise, for centuries in Europe, what divided people was not the color of their skins. The English, French, Spanish, Germans were constantly at war with each other. Scandinavians pillaged Irish villages. Christians persecuted Jews. Catholics and Protestants massacred each other. Blood spilled and servitude imposed had as little to do with skin pigment as with eye color or shoe size. And just as there were no black people in Africa, there were no people in America who thought of themselves as white. When Europeans colonized those 13 colonies, they came as Englishmen, Welshmen, or Scots, Germans, Corsicans, or Poles, Mennonites, Catholics, Lutherans, Jews, and Anglicans. Besides their economic station, it was national, ethnic, and religious identities that determined how they conceived of themselves and compared themselves to others. Until a threatened colonial elite constructed a new hierarchy with powerful incentives for disparate groups to subordinate their separate identities under a new racial banner of whiteness. This is what theorists mean when they refer to the social construction of race, the fallacy that an incidental physiologic trait, the level of melanin in the skin, correlates with significant social, behavioral, or intellectual differences between people. From this false pseudoscientific premise of race, it is but a tiny step to racism, ascribing positive or negative values to people identified by that otherwise meaningless trait, then elevating or debasing these so-called races according to those purported differences. And so it was right from the inception of our country, whiteness and blackness were born together. Mirror images, Siamese twins, defining themselves by what they were not. One's existence was not possible without the other's. Race and its offspring, racism, based on a mythical reality. Mythical, to be clear, because there's as much genetic variation between individuals of the same continent, say Europe, as between individuals of different continents, say Europe and Asia and Africa, for pertinent examples. The DNA is essentially all the same. And we are at halftime. And let me see if I just want to see time check here. Yeah, that's pretty exciting. Okay, I'm just happy to be on time. I'm sharing my happiness with you. But okay, I'm looking in the chat, and if anyone else has any other thoughts on what might be provocative and counterintuitive, or any other things that pop into your mind, raise your hand, speak up. I'll go from screen to screen here. Joan, again, Joan? No. Oh, you're muted, Joan. You're muted.
Oh, there I go. Okay. Case in point. So I was just going to say the reason why I'm talking again is because I have no idea how to use chat. So I have no choice.
Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to diss you. Joan is my best friend from elementary school, by the way.
So I thought it was great. The only thing that I thought, about was you defined racism, I don't know your exact words, but is as descriptions of positive things or negative things. I forget the exact words.
Yeah.
And I take exception to saying that positive things are racism, because I think racism has a direct relationship to power, structural power.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. I'm done.
Yeah. Message received. Yeah. I guess I just meant to mean distinguishing people based on factors like that. But yeah, point taken. Sure. Other thoughts? John? Muted. You're muted.
I was
You're
trying
all
to behave myself. Okay. I think the thing that's the hardest step to make in your own thinking, in my own thinking, is really internalizing the idea that race is a fiction. Because we grew up thinking that it was a real thing. And I think if we can get to that point, a lot of other things change when it becomes obviously fictional. The other thing I was going to say is that Ibram Kendi, I think, in How to Be Anti-Racist, traces the origin of race to, I think, a Spanish or Portuguese writer who was currying favor with the royalty of that country in the 16th century, before what happened in Virginia, when there was a very active slave trade between Africa and Europe, and especially Iberian Peninsula. So it seems like this was figured out independently in several places and all around slavery of African people.
Yeah. Well, that 1443 reference was a previous pope authorizing Portuguese folks who were flying south, sailing south to Africa. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone, just feel free to speak up and not be recognized, I'm thinking, by me. If anyone has a thought. Colin Barbara. I'll read Sol and Barbara's last comment in case you don't see it. The European idea that there was something inherently wrong with Black people was a repetition of earlier ideas about other groups. There is something inherently wrong with Muslims, Jews, pagans. Yeah. Do you think that was Barb and Sol, whoever, that was related to their heathen status rather than, I mean,
Yeah, they were just doing what they've been doing for centuries,
Yeah.
which was designating a group as different, and that there was inside them things were terribly wrong. And so even if Jews or Muslims, pagans converted to Christianity, they couldn't be trusted because there was damage inside them. So they already had that very alive before they ever came to the what we now call the Americas. And so they just transfer that same kind of thinking to this new situation, I think.
yeah, but that's a religious root, right? I mean, what was wrong with them was that they didn't subscribe to Christianity, or is it something else wrong with them?
In this situation, I gave an example, it was based on subscribing to Christianity. Other people might know more. My understanding is that they did that around other kinds of groupings as well, of identifying different groups of people. But if they were Christians, it was different. It may have not been only about their religious status. It may have been about other things about them as well.
This is triggering other thoughts, but it's kind of amazing how we all were taught this by our environment and our people who were not obviously racist, but somehow it's all been passed on to us.
Yeah, yeah. It's possible that is a segue to what I'm going to do next.
Oh, segue into next.
Yeah. So, all right, hold other thoughts. We'll keep going. I'm trying to keep those short so we can have time at the end. So I hope you don't feel cut off or that I'm missing someone.
We got one more question, Dennis. You want
Okay,
that?
sure. Yeah.
Okay, so do you think if people rediscover their pre-Christian roots, then the issue of supremacy will go away?
They're
If you go way back. Pre-Christian roots.
Now, that is some kind of question. Well, yes. No, I don't know. It's a good question. Yeah, no, it's good. I like these questions. Okay, we're moving. So, to get back to our beginnings, having created the black and white creature called race, within 6 years of the Jamestown Rebellion, the Virginia House of Burgesses, through a series of slave acts, set about conferring on whites a position of dominance and consigning blacks to live lives of degradation and bondage. For starters, indentured servitude for blacks, previously for a set period, was by law extended to lifelong servitude, that is, slavery. Resistance to the orders of a white person were now punishable by whipping. Specifically, the law exacted 30 lashes, well laid on. Owners who killed their slaves in the course of punishing them were not to be held liable, enshrining impunity for white on black violence into law. The law's chapter and verse read, "If any slave resist his master's correction and shall happen to be killed in such correction, the master shall be free and acquitted of all punishment," as if such accident had never happened. So this is the Black Lives Do Not Matter Act of 1705. Since heathen status was a fundamental Christian justification for slavery, the dilemma of how to contend with baptized slaves was reconciled by simply declaring that baptism would no longer exempt Blacks from bondage. And the most enduring and radical legislation was this. Centuries of English common law held that the father's legal status determined that of his children. The Virginia legislature switched paternal to maternal, and that change now consigned children of enslaved women to be slaves themselves, creating slavery that would be hereafter hereditary for generations without end, providing as well license for white men to make sexual use of Black women with impunity. 100 years after hereditary slavery was codified in Virginia, that institution was now embedded in our national constitution. We, the people, knew who they were and who they weren't. Black lives mattered only in as much as 3/5 of their enslaved numbers would be added to the census of the white population to increase the number of representatives that Southern states would have in Congress. Fast forward another 100 years or so, here's the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Take a few seconds to read it. An amendment whose 6-word phrase, except as a punishment for crime, was then deployed as a pretext to criminalize living while Black as states saw fit, arresting and convicting African Americans for virtually anything, then jailing them or imposing fines they could not pay, thus subjecting post-emancipation Blacks to chain gangs and debt bondage. And still over a century later, with a cash bail system and pressured plea bargaining, to modern day mass incarceration. And to this very day, to the ever-present threat of extrajudicial killings. This racially skewed criminal justice system has parallel historical correlates of prejudicial and exclusory laws and policies to degrade living conditions for people of color in every other facet of life as well. Each predicated on the white supremacist belief that Black lives matter less, are worth less, deserve less. From unequal justice to inferior education, due to dilapidated schools, property tax-based school funding, gutting public education, school choice option for wealthier families, substandard housing, from rigid segregation to redlining to so-called urban renewal projects, restricted unemployment, from outright discrimination to exclusion based on inadequate educational training, to denial of credit, from outright post-Reconstruction theft of assets to effective exclusion from the GI Bill that made widespread home ownership possible for whites but not for Blacks, to restricted loans for Black businesses, from slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to today's gerrymandering system, where politicians pick their voters rather than voters picking their politicians, to the aggressive campaigns ongoing this very moment designed to disenfranchise Black voters. All policies, not just attitudes, each amplifying the damage of the others, the very opposite of a safety net. These are an interlocking chain link weight dragging down the living conditions of an entire race. We can reasonably call the social pyramid constructed by white supremacy nourished by it both, religious and racial roots, by its original full name, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant supremacy, whose apex has broadened slightly to include wealthy white Protestants of other ethnicities. Here's a broad strokes depiction that lacks nuance, but provides an overview. Take a look, and we'll spend a couple of minutes visiting the pyramid. It features a gray scale with various degrees of privilege and acceptance, as various other nationalities, ethnicities, and religions over the generations have migrated their way along its gradients. In the top tier, there are differing shades of white, distinguished by the cultural passport of whiteness, blended with different levels of economic comfort. While non-white peoples and more recent arrivals languish in a zone of closed doors, more stifled opportunities, and cultural hostility. But one constant throughout our history is that African Americans as a demographic have remained firmly mired in the basement of this triangle, under the weight of the multiple systemic structures designed from the very inception of our history to cast Blacks out and keep them down, even as their stolen labor provided the economic foundation of the nation's wealth. Another pause here to catch our breath, field any thoughts you have before a final segment looking at racial stereotyping as a distinct bitter fruit of white supremacy with a life of its own, and the era of white backlash that we're now experiencing, and maybe why. Yeah. Everyone hanging in there? Go ahead. Let's see. Larry Danziger says, I would put Native Americans on the same level as African Americans.
Yep.
I'm not sure. Michael Young is asking, what determined the attitude of these groups on the pyramid? And I'm not sure I understand the question. Michael?
Altitude, Dennis.
Yeah,
I said altitude. So what level?
Oh,
What was that?
Yeah, sorry. That's an easier question than attitude, I guess. Yeah. I think I would take refuge in the non-nuanced description of that pyramid. People can quibble with justification about who goes where in the middle, but it certainly seems clear that what the apex is sort of clear, and the things go up and down in the middle, and Blacks, although Larry might disagree, it seems as though, just based on the structural impediments, that the people of color, Black, seem to be in a level by themselves. My thought, but feel free to disagree, of course.
Dennis?
Yes.
Dennis, you're making the case for the intertwining of Christianity and racism, but capitalism is also part of that, at least in this country. That's been a basic reason for the ongoing suppression of people of color. Is that another lecture?
Well, it's less than, it's obviously, well, not a lecture from me, but yeah, we can get a little bit more into how class figures in all of this and capitalism. So let's circle back around to that one. Yeah. I mean, obviously right from the very beginning, it was deployed as a strategy but you're talking about more than that, I believe. Yeah,
It's a really good.
yeah.
Dennis, this is Phyllis.
Yeah, hi, Phil.
I've always kind of wondered why we keep referring to the continent where people came from or were brought from 200 and 300 years ago by referring to people that I might call Black now as being African Americans. I mean, they've been here for 200-300 years. They're Americans. You know, we don't like necessarily say to every white person, you're Irish American or you're Swedish American or you're English American, especially English American. You know, I mean, we don't hang on to the country of origin as long as it was from Europe, but as long as it's from this continent of Africa, not even like saying, oh, you're Rwandan African or a Rwandan American or you're Zambian American or something. I don't like to actually even refer to people anymore that are Black and maybe had ancestry in slavery that came from Africa as being African American. They're Americans. They've been here for long enough. They don't need to continue to be referred to by their place of origin. And I'm curious about that.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts about that?
Phyllis, this is Larry Danziger.
Hi, Larry.
Hi. How do you think the quote unquote African Americans want to identify themselves? Can you ask them that? I want to be called Larry. I don't even want to be called Mr. Danziger. So if you want to know what I want to be called, ask me. So same thing. I haven't asked them very often that question either. And I've been certainly going back and forth about Native people as to whether or not they want to be called Native Americans or Indians and or something else. Well, a lot of them want to be called Wabanakis rather than anything else. So go to the source.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. It's respectful for any one individual in a group. You know, I mean, the group is calling themselves Blacks because they're saying Black Lives Matter. They're not saying Afro-American Lives Matter. I mean, I'm just curious about our ongoing attachment to that particular terminology.
Yeah.
Good point.
Good point. Yeah.
Could I add something? This is LJ.
Sure.
I consider myself to be third generation European American. And I write that on forms when they have me fill it out. That's helped me, you know, with this issue, thinking about it differently.
Yeah. Duly noted. Last thoughts before we take, we're in the last lap, and then we can stop stopping and keep talking. All right, we're going. So, in addition to the heavy burdens of structural racism, white supremacy has also afflicted us all with another derivative cultural illness with a life of its own, compounding this exploitation. An overlying oppressive layer of both insult and injury created by the mythologies of racial stereotyping, originally fabricated by white people for white people to rationalize the practice of slavery. Since who among us wouldn't prefer to view ourselves as virtuous and our actions honorable, acting in accordance with God's natural law, as expressed here by the Vice President of the Confederacy? Take a moment to appreciate his honesty. So to reconcile morality, whoa, wait a minute, something just happened here. Whoa, sorry. To reconcile morality with enslavement, the hybrid religious and racial roots of white supremacy produced another bitter fruit, the wholesale slander of Africans as an inferior race, depicting blacks as docile or dangerous or childlike or shiftless, ape-like, hypersexual, savage, shuffling, carefree, simple, bestial, rhythmic, insensible to pain, primitive, impulsive, ungrateful, and all the rest. These white descriptions of purportedly innate characteristics of Black people were invented, but not arbitrary. Some were to paint victims not just as genetically inferior, but as a species apart, in order to not view barbaric treatment of other human beings as uncivilized. Many are behavioral characteristics that oppressors encounter from people subject to the whip and chain, forced labor, sexual abuse, exploited people making best use of the various strategies available to them of active, passive, or creative resistance, appeasement, deception, secrecy. Some were natural reactions to being enslaved. Once inoculated into our culture, this germ of denigrating stereotypes multiplied and invaded every legal, social, cultural, even scientific pore in our body politic. It was disseminated by writers and clergy, philosophers and presidents, scientists and physicians, academics, businessmen, journalists, by publicists, politicians, and government officials to every hearth and home. Even the minds of many anti-slavers, whose opposition to bondage was rooted in a sense of humanity and justice, but not a belief in racial equality, were nurtured in this racist broth. Take a quick read. Hear from the emancipator himself. From our founding to our present, this disease of racial stereotyping has over generations infected white minds with this pejorative bias and has of course afflicted Black minds as well, which from childhood can't help viewing themselves to some degree through the cruel distortion lens of the dominant culture that surrounds them. This is not just antebellum American history. The outcome of the Civil War did little to eradicate this illness in its continuing forms. The epidemic of post-Reconstruction lynchings, continuing over many decades, well into the 20th century, grisly, public, exemplary tortures and executions, often festive occasions held in broad daylight, while sheriffs and police looked away or looked on, represented the most flagrant and defiant face of white supremacy, designed to underscore who was still in charge and who shouldn't forget it. And if we are to say its name, we should also pause to look at its face and listen to take just how deep-seated and vile is this curse of white supremacy before moving on. So here's Abel Meeropol's poem, Strange Fruit, written while lynchings were still fresh in mind. And here's Billie Holiday singing his lines.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on leaves and blood at the road. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
Here's the second verse. So strange and bitter fruit. A cultural disorder this old, this deep, may wax and wane, but does not disappear. Over 3 centuries, it is mutated into a secondary and distinct social malady with a life of its own and is embedded in our social DNA. One need not subscribe to an ideology of white superiority to harbor this endemic cultural virus. One need only live in a society with white supremacist roots. Likewise, one needn't personally have had anything to do with the origins of white supremacy in our country to benefit from the structural advantages that white people, natural born or immigrant, enjoy by virtue of their skin color, or to be infected with a racial bias, flagrant or subtle, that surrounds us all. It's not our fault, but it is our inherited cultural genetic illness for us to contend with, first step of which is acknowledging the diagnosis. And likewise, one needn't be well off for skin color to confer benefit on us. Racial privilege and economic disadvantage often coexist. Remember, it was wealthy Virginia planters in the first place who codified race-based discrimination to deflect and compensate the grievances of their poorer white colonists. But that concept can be a tough sell to white folks who themselves don't enjoy a life of leisure, who may not have much interest in Virginia colonial history, and who might reasonably bristle when portrayed as privileged. White supremacy confers relative, not absolute privilege. Privilege is hard to appreciate if, as most of us do, we look upward at those with more assets rather than below us, to take in that we are cushioned by the floor of a caste structure that spares us situations far worse. Because as bad as it is for so many white folks, it is far worse, as shown here, tenfold worse for Black families. The legacy of cumulative generation race-based deprivation. This session has been focused on white supremacy's deep roots and bitter fruits, as the title said, not a game plan for how to begin to undo the legacy of centuries of oppression. But for starters, one way forward is to recognize that the 2 main variants of these bitter fruits have different qualities, and so remediation requires different approaches, the right tool for the job, as it were. The damages wrought by systemic racism won't be undone solely by examining our own personal biases and trying to change our attitudes. Remedies for those different systems of education, criminal justice, housing, employment, lending, glaring income gaps, voter suppression, political representation, all in need of repair, are specific and concrete policy changes. In contrast, the pernicious effects of racial stereotyping embedded in our culture over centuries are resistant to legislative fixes. Rooting them out calls for an intensive, extensive, open-ended detoxification process that asks each of us and all of us to unlearn what we've learned, to recognize those implicit biases, to have those uncomfortable conversations with others. This is just a schematic roadmap for how to begin to disentangle ourselves from our sorry legacy. The fallacy of race and its own twin racist progeny, white superiority, non-white inferiority, and all the suffering it's caused. But the social evolution we need now to make us all whole is more messy and uncharted, because the dynamic that made a racial hierarchy based on white supremacy successful in the 17th century colonies remains with us today, but is on shakier ground. Here's Lyndon Johnson describing W.E.B. Du Bois' psychological wages and their trade-offs in more down-home terms. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. In fact, the entire economic bottom 50% of our population, here in red, has steadily been getting its pocket picked, now with just half the share of national wealth that they had 50 years ago, and falling. But recent white generations are now incurring at the same time a sharp cut in those compensatory wages that underwrote the system's stability in a shifting, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious, multilingual, soon to be majority minority society. First-class social status in a white Protestant English-speaking country, that is baseline privilege, which if nothing else, so many white folks have always been able to take for granted, is no longer assured. That is an implicit breach of contract, a betrayal even. And when people who could always imagine that they were at least cultural insiders start feeling like outsiders, they cast themselves as victims, sometimes in apocalyptic terms. The driving emotion is that of existential threat. Here's a billboard with a more straightforward message than the usual subtext from those historically advantaged, now feeling victimized, now mobilizing to take back our country and our values, our language, our culture, and our rights. When incited by the highest levels to act to take back the theft of what they are given to believe is rightfully theirs, people who feel victimized and aggrieved will storm barricades, break down doors, seek out traitors. This is literally violent pushback against all those they have been given to believe have hijacked their country and threaten their place in it. Blacks, immigrants, Democrats, communists, the deep state, coastal elites, Jewish financiers, take your pick. And with today's social media echo chambers, combined with the disintegration of fact-based civic discourse, it's not clear just where we are headed. Where we go from here is certainly a whole other conversation. For some interim comfort, we can hark back to someone who saw us through the last civil and uncivil war and hope that in this swirl of fake news and conspiracy mindsets, we too can successfully consummate the sentence that he began like this, which seems to be where we are right now. Meanwhile, I'd like to end on an aspirational message with hats off, as always, to Gary Larson, who reminds us that if cows can figure out what they've been fed all these years, there might be hope for us too. There. Okay. Good. All right. Well, that's what I've got for you. And now the official times are 6 to 7:30. I'm happy to stay as long as you like. We don't have to go anytime soon, but some people feel free. You obviously do. So.
I think Jerry Gross has something to say.
Jerry Gross has something to say.
Unmute yourself.
Oh, Jerry.
Then
Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Graph that with the red line and the green line.
Yeah.
Would it be possible to go back to that and explain that a little more? It might be very simple. I just.
Yeah. I think, hold on. I think. Let me find it. Almost there. Here we go. There. So there we are. So the red line is the share of total income of the bottom 50% in red of wealth in the country, and blue, inversely or conversely or whatever, is the share of the top 1%.
Okay.
Is that?
Yep, now I get it. I get it. I think I didn't know what the blue one was.
Yeah, maybe because I didn't tell you, sorry.
Oh no, holy smokes, that's.
Yeah.
That's. It's like that quote that you had about if you can convince the poorest white man that he's better off than the richest black man, then you just take that right to the bank. Anyway, get us all fighting amongst ourselves. Thank you, Dennis. This was great. Very, very good.
Sure. Other thoughts from other people?
Well, thank you again, Dennis. It's Phyllis. If people haven't watched the Netflix documentary series, it's a 6-part series called Amend. It's narrated by a lot of Black actors and starts out with Will Smith. It's so incredibly powerful. It overlaps a lot of what you have done, Dennis, and expands it. And one of the things that floored me was a lot of it is at the beginning is talking about the 13th and 14th Amendments and the work of Frederick Douglass to convince Abraham Lincoln to change his mind. Because when he freed the slaves, he was under the impression that separate but equal was the way to go. And he wanted the Black slaves in this country to leave the country. And he offered them to go and start their own country in Costa Rica, which was like mind-blowing. I had no idea. And Frederick Douglass had to convince him that there was another way to go about this. So it's an incredibly powerful series. I'm on episode 4 right now. So, but it's so worth seeing. Absolutely.
That's great.
Dennis?
Yes.
Just one simple little step that people can take right now to maybe start to help undoing this is write to your senators, because HR 1 got sent over last week to the Senate, which is the restoration of the voting rights, and encourage them to vote yes to get that legislation in place.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. John's got a question.
Yeah, not a question, but just one quick thing. At the beginning, Barb and I both mentioned the evaluation form. I just put the link to it in the chat. If you feel inspired, we'd appreciate it before you log off to take a minute and do that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dennis.
Sure.
Our next forum will be in April. And let's see, what is the date? April 7th on Wednesday, 6 o'clock. We're going to have Mary Taylor from Literacy Volunteers of Bangor. And the flyer should be going out shortly. We'll also post it on our Facebook page with a link to sign up. So I appreciate everyone coming. Any last minute questions for Dennis? And don't forget to do the evaluation, please.
It can be
I have a comment.
And we'll send that out to everyone as well. So
feel free. We have more time if people would like it. You might be sitting with something. You can dive.
Yeah, I have a comment.
Hi, Ursa.
Hey, Dennis. Thanks so much for doing this. So I just want to go back to kind of the beginning, and Barb brought up the settlers heading west. And I've kind of been mulling this over the whole time, and it also, your language also struck me as generous to the settlers heading west. And I feel like what is important about that, kind of to build on what Barb said, is that the problematic idea there for me would be that the settlers didn't bear any responsibility for genocide of Native Americans, that it was the political leaders or the people who maybe bear more of the responsibility, but that the general sort of white population that was swept up in this policy sort of doesn't bear responsibility. And I would give them responsibility. And so fast forward, I would say the same about mobs of thousands of white people, sometimes the entire community, that would turn out for a racial terror lynching in broad daylight, sometimes at the courthouse lawn with food trucks and postcards being printed with pictures of the lynching. People would get those postcards, send them to each other. Afterward, they would take home body parts as souvenirs. So that mob of white people sort of standing by, similarly, I would give them some responsibility. And the reason that I think that is important for today is that I think there's a tendency today to give the responsibility for white supremacy and racial injustice to others, to say that, because some of the things that Donald Trump says are outlandish, or, other people wave Confederate flags or wear horned helmets, or sometimes say explicitly racist things, that that this is theirs. And so I think that's important, because in the same way as those settlers heading west, I think that this is ours. And so I wanted to say that, because those things that you listed that people could do, I feel like it's easy to see those as things that sort of we could do out of the goodness of our heart to address someone else's problem, rather than things that we urgently need to do, because this is something that we are causing and perpetuating, by our inaction. And I just think back to James Baldwin saying that a civilization is not destroyed by wicked people. It is not necessary that people be wicked, but only that they be spineless.
Thank you for that, Ursa. I guess what I'd want to just say to that I probably didn't communicate what I meant to mean in terms of settlers. And thank you, Barbara, again, for your, all I meant to mean was that I suspect that the settlers were not as conversant as was Supreme Court Justice John Marshall with the doctrine of discovery as the formal reason that they could be given free land by the government. I didn't mean to mean that they were not, that they didn't consider the First Nations scum or racist or worthy of genocide, really. So, I mean, I think that might be a difference without a distinction, but yeah, thank you for bringing it up that way. Anyone else? John?
Yeah, I want to first really thank Ursa for what he said so eloquently. And kind of add to that, I think the hardest piece of this is really understanding the truth of what's happening and understanding the truth of our own roles and the truth of what we're carrying around, not necessarily consciously, that we act out. And that's tough because that process can destroy a lot of pleasant illusions we have. But I think that's essential. And I think if we really work on that, then the things we need to do sort of become more obvious because we're seeing them every day then. But that's the hard part, is not finding it. You know, it's easy to make fun of, like someone said, the guys with the horned helmets. It's harder to look at our own position and how what's involved in the position we're in right now.
This is LJ again. I actually have something to add to that. I'd like to go, I followed the protests online all year, and what I saw is that one thing I could do was have conversation, sitting here on my computer, have conversations. Like, I wanted to talk to racists, but then when it comes down to like, well, who do I talk to? Oh, my neighbors, like people who live in my apartment complex. And then it gets to be like, I don't want to ruin our relationship or our situation because I have to live here. But the people I mostly follow people in Seattle and Portland, and they would say, yeah, well, that's what we have to live with. Every single day we're living with racism right next door to us. And it is a big deal, but they were like basically calling on the white privilege to be willing to like make that sacrifice in order to help. It's kind of like good cops stop bad cops. And I was just thinking, good people stop bad people. Like, have to be willing to like sacrifice. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Pete?
Yeah, just been thinking, as white people, we've benefited from those 400-600 years. We've benefited from it, and our lives today are, our situation today, our comfort, our moving around in a little superior position, not really thinking about the color of our skin, is thanks to that. So I don't know, I think it's worth thinking about what might our life be like if we didn't have that privilege, and maybe as a way to think about shedding some of it, because like that great quote that we read there, it just might feel like oppression or like we're losing something if things were more equal. And we might, instinctively, without thinking about it, not really want to go there.
Good thought experiment, right? Thanks. Pete. Okay. Well, we might be done. Does anyone think we might not be? Well, it's been a treat to see you all, and I'm glad you all saw each other too.
And
Thank you.
muted or muted.